thanks again for your patience. Sorry about that bit of technical trouble this morning, but everything is as it should be now. Thanks for being here in the morning, much appreciated for this session, Basic Income, Putting Cash in People's Pockets. I'm Cleo, I'm the co-founder of a project called Basic Income Conversation, and I'm also a wonderful organisation called Autonomy's Basic Income Lead. I'm chairing today's session in my capacity as basic income nerd. I sort of have a good understanding of the technical stuff because I speak to lots of technical, clever people about it and try and understand what they're talking about. But I also have spent the last 4 years talking to hundreds of people about basic income, largely across the UK, but also a bit internationally, and talking at thousands of people about basic income, again across the UK. And it is an incredible concept to get into the heart of a lot of today's social issues and a lot of the things that I think politically we're looking to shift. It's a really compelling idea, which I think makes it quite divisive, and again, something that really opens up some interesting conversations. Because it might be UBI in your head, a universal basic income, because it is universal, it affects everyone, or it would affect everyone, it is a real opportunity to talk to everyone, to build big policy that makes a massive shift in our society. And if we build it together, I think that's how we make sure that it actually has the kind of impact that we talk about maybe it possibly having. So what is basic income? What am I talking about when I say that? You might have heard about it from a person like me, perhaps a sort of Financial Times headline, or perhaps a sort of Silicon Valley tech bro. But a basic income has to have 5 characteristics to be a basic income. The first is that it's cash, so it's money that people can spend however they want. The second is that it's regular, so like any other kind of income, you're paid it on a regular basis, you know when the next payment is coming. The third is it's paid to the individual, so we would all get a basic income of our own for the first time in history. Everyone would have an income of their own. The fourth and probably most important characteristic is that it's completely unconditional. So everyone is paid their basic income as a right. You don't have to do anything. You get your basic income regardless of anything else. And the fifth is that it's universal. So again, this is the sort of big picture concept that a basic income has, that everyone would get a basic income. The kind of basic income I'm talking about has a few characteristics or a few principles, I suppose, that underpin it, that make it a bit different from perhaps the basic income that other people are talking about, and one of those is that it is redistributive. So it disproportionately benefits people that currently have least, and is disproportionately contributed to by people that have a lot. People, organisations, the corporations, places where there is an abundance that should be shared out a bit more fairly. A basic income should be designed to redistribute that. The second is that it is truly unconditional, so you know that point of it being without conditions, without strings attached is really important. You sort of hear talk of digital currency, central bank digital currency, and social credit system when you talk about basic income. These are coming out in the comments, and sort of often when I'm in the sort of old manny pubs in Edinburgh talking to people about it, that's something that comes up, and I think we'd be foolish to dismiss that out of hand. That we need to make sure that a basic income is truly accessible to people, and digital exclusion is not part of introducing something like this. The final thing is that it aspires to be adequate. So it might not start out adequate, it might be a low-level basic income to begin with that is then built upon. The amount a basic income isn't baked into what a basic income as a concept is. You could have a very low basic income of £5 a week and still tick off those 5 characteristics, but of course a much higher basic income would have a much larger impact. And that is what we're kind of hoping for, an adequate basic income at a high enough level to provide a certain standard of living. But there is also the acknowledgement that a basic income in and of itself is not going to ever provide that standard of living, that quality of life that we want to see. A basic income needs to be part of a wider system and wider change to make sure that everyone is guaranteed that dignity and that quality of life. So things like services need to exist, things like targeted benefits for people or for situations that aren't universal, certain phases of life, disability, for example, which makes your cost of living much, much higher. So that is the concept of basic income. The UK context starts out probably in Scotland in the last sort of 5 years with a significant amount of money being invested in a feasibility study looking at whether basic income pilots were possible in Scotland, which produced a fantastic report outlining how you can do really amazing basic income pilots that unfortunately they found were unfeasible without the cooperation of central government. That then led to the Welsh Government working around that and kicking off the UK's first basic income pilot. There are currently 635 people in the UK receiving a basic income. These are care leavers who have turned 18 and aged out of the care system in Wales. They receive £1,600 a month. This is taxed. This does make them ineligible for other benefits, other income support from the social security system. So it's a little bit lower, or quite significantly lower than that £1,600 mark, but it does mean that they have this stable income for the first 2 years of their adulthood. We should be seeing results from that quite soon, sort of 2025. That's actually not that soon. Clearly, I am a big basic income nerd, that excited about these stats coming out in a couple of years. There is a global body of evidence on basic income. There have been dozens and dozens of pilots around the world, and we'll hear about some of these today. I do have a couple of videos that I hope I can send round to you from people working on these pilots and participating in these pilots that we were hoping to show you today. Hopefully I'll be able to send them to you as links in due course. The US is a really exciting part of the global basic income movement at the moment. There is a lot more sort of real momentum behind the work that is happening there. This started in 2018 with a basic income pilot in Stockton, California, trailblazed by Mayor Michael Tubbs, who was very inspired by the teachings of Martin Luther King, who was a guaranteed income advocate, sort of the language they use around basic income there. So 125 people in Stockton received a basic income of $500 a month for 2 years in 2018, and since then over 100 pilots have been announced in the US. So massive momentum. Some of these are aspiring to be permanent policies, and in fact they're shifting the language away from pilot to program because they aren't pilots. The data is there now, there is so much collected. It's more about short-term measures that they hope will lead to permanent measures of putting cash in people's pockets, which I think moves us nicely to the theme and the speakers today. Some of these conversations I've had about basic income have been in Jarrow and in Grange and East Finchley with communities there and the big locals in these areas particularly who have led significant work into consulting the community on what they think of basic income, and this led to the proposal of 2 basic income pilots in these areas that we're currently working on getting funded, so that's really exciting. This brings me on to finally introducing the rest of the panel. We have Kate Osborne, who is the MP for Jarrow, who's going to tell us a bit about her perspective. We have Neil Howard, who has worked on multiple basic income pilots, including the Work Free pilot in Hyderabad, which combines community organising and a basic income to look at how it can free people from exploitation. We also have Will Strong, my colleague, one of the directors of Autonomy, who will join for the Q&A. He's not going to do any 10-minute speech, but he'll have lots of insights for us during the Q&A. As I said, I run a project called Basic Income Conversation. I really want this to be a bit of a conversation today, so as you're listening, do think of questions, comments, things that you want to bring up in the context of this conversation. We'd love to reply to them, answer them perhaps if they're technical questions, but yeah, really want to make sure that we're hearing from you today. I did say that I would do a sort of housekeeping thing, which I've waited to the end of an introduction to do, which I apologise for. Fire exits are clearly marked by the green sign, so if there is an alarm, please do leave the building as quickly and calmly as possible, and the Chinese arch is where we'll meet. Toilets are also over there. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to Kate.
Thank you so much, and good morning everybody. I want to start off by apologising that I can't stay for the whole of this event. Our conference schedules are so manic, so I'm afraid it's just not possible. I would like to have stayed for all the debate and the questions, so apologies in advance that I will be leaving before the end. So, representing the historic constituency of Jarrow as I do, this topic is hugely important. Our communities are facing the worst cost of living crisis in decades, and we need an urgent conversation on the best way to rebuild and redistribute wealth in this country. And I'm really pleased that we have a UBI pilot in Jarrow and that UBI is part of that conversation. Talking of my constituency, 87 years ago, just this week, 200 people began the nearly 300-mile march from Jarrow to London to demand the government address issues of unemployment and poverty. And around 70% of workers in the town being left unemployed by the Great Depression, concerned about jobs and hungry families. Jump forward to today, and the North East is in the midst of a child poverty epidemic, with parts of my constituency having 39% of children living in food poverty. That's nearly 6,000 children in Jarrow overall. And people forget the faces behind those stats. So if you think in an average classroom of 25 kids in Jarrow, 10 of them will be sitting there hungry. And the struggles many families faced 87 years ago are similar to the struggles families are facing today. Struggles caused by 13 years of callous Tory governments and their vicious cuts, destroying the fabric of society and vital services our communities rely on. 13 years of chaos, incompetence and corruption has led to millions living in poverty. A huge increase between the very richest and the rest of us, and an increase in regional inequalities, not to mention that they crashed the economy. So how will UBI help? There's clearly a case for urgent action, and I should also put on record my thanks to the researchers and collaborators who have worked incredibly hard to make the Jarrow pilot a reality. What we need from this pilot is more evidence to show the benefits of UBI and how it can transform society. UBI has the potential to tackle the wealth gap whilst ensuring solid long-term foundations are built to ensure that everyone can live life with financial security. There's so many areas that are being destroyed by the Tories that UBI could benefit. Take social care. It's on its knees. Reablement services don't exist. Home helps, meals on wheels, house adaptations, all services no longer provided by most local authorities. UBI could support care work, compensating for society's traditionally unpaid work without continuing the gendered distribution of labour, and allow people to work without losing the benefits that they need. The current benefits model doesn't work. It fails to provide enough to live on, and this disproportionately impacts on women who still largely provide most of society's care needs. Whilst it's true that UBI cannot create a more equal society, although UBI destroys sexism would be a wonderful headline, it can begin to break away at the fundamental sexism that discriminates and penalises women who stay at home to care. In March 2020, an estimated 1.6 million women aged 16 to 74 experienced domestic abuse within the last year. So again, these are structural problems in society that need addressing. And UBI alone isn't going to solve the epidemic of violence against women and girls. But UBI does have the potential to make it easier for women to exit situations in which they would otherwise be economically dependent on other people, helping women escape domestic abuse situations. There's been other pilots of UBI in Wales and other countries, as has been said, and there is evidence that UBI would alleviate poverty and boost people's health and well-being. A universal basic income could put a solid foundation beneath people so that they can live life with security. It could lift people out of poverty and have a huge impact on costs to the NHS and our local services. I know that many people reject the idea of a universal basic income due to its potential cost, with the argument that the price outweighs the benefit. Yet we're living in one of the richest countries in the world, with a Prime Minister who is considerably more wealthy than the King, and we have many working families struggling to make ends meet. This lot of wasted billions on faulty PPE, contracts for their cronies, and through their corrupt incompetence. Poverty is a political choice, and for me, we can't afford not to lift people out of poverty. Every month I have constituents contact me about having no money to feed their children or pay their bills, and have been left with no other choice but to turn to food banks. We have a grossly unequal society where for decades the richest have got richer and the poorest poorer. And it's time for a radical shake-up. As an MP who spends a lot of time campaigning on the NHS, and as a side note, I see the Telegraph have attacked the Socialist Health Association and me today for standing on the picket lines with the doctors, which of course I will always do. We must take into account UBI's potential to alleviate costs and pressure on the NHS. The savings could be significant and has the potential to hugely benefit the NHS and all of us. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has estimated that poverty costs the NHS more than any other public service at a massive £29 billion per year. UBI would tackle malnutrition. Kids go into hospital with scurvy, dentistry in the headlines again this week with the amount of kids going into hospital to have teeth removed because their parents can't afford toothpaste. Right-wing shock jocks blaming parents for not teaching kids how to brush their teeth and saying schools picking up this advice to kids is a nanny state. But basic public health advice is absolutely the job of the state. We used to have school nurses that went in that would have picked this up. And I'm not sure, looking at the age of this audience, if any of you had a knit nurse. But they did used to give advice to all areas of hygiene. But the basic point is when people cannot afford food, they're not going to prioritise buying toothpaste. It absolutely sickens me that the food bank I do my monthly casework surgeries in has to have essentials packs. These packs include soap and toothpaste, toilet rolls, shampoo, sanitary products. One mum coming in to us crying that her 14-year-old daughter couldn't go to school that day because she couldn't afford sanitary products. Another headline just this week was food banks are having to ration baby milk. Situations like this are what inspired people 87 years ago to march on London, and they are what fuel my anger and passion to make a difference. We cannot continue to accept the millions in poverty, millions of homeless, the richest country in the world, yet so many are destitute. And there's little help for people from the state now. Food banks and charities do the bulk of the work, yet another sign that our benefit system just does not work. Our social security system has become so distorted that it no longer operates in the way that it was intended. No one on benefits is secure. It barely helps those who most need it. And UBI could be the radical reform that the system needs. Those involved in this pilot led by Northumbria University believe UBI could have a positive effect, and I hope that their findings will be used by an incoming Labour government and local authorities to inform policy. This government continues with their attempts to divide and rule, attack on people, on benefits, attacks on refugees, on the LGBTQ community, and in particular on our trans siblings. The other side note today, another side note, today I was attacked by the Daily Mail for my support for trans people. It's only day one and I've ticked attacked by the Telegraph and the Daily Mail off of my conference bingo. At Tory conference, they ramped up their attacks on trans people and workers versus shirkers rhetoric. We must call this out and stand up against all of their hate, oppose their divide and rule attempts, and combat them with clear policy demands, support for the LGBTQI+ community, for roots out of poverty, and to fix our broken country. I hope the pilot in Jarrow provides all the evidence we need to make UBI a part of how we rescue the country. Thank you very much, and I'll stay as long as I can. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate. Neil, I'm going to pass on to you.
Thank you very much. Hello everybody, morning. I have to begin with a shout out to my mum, who's there. Staunch socialist ally. Alright, Mum. Alright, so I'm Neil. I'm a researcher and an advocate working on, amongst other things, basic income at the University of Bath. I study pilots, experiments in relation to the use of cash and related things as part of social policy reform. I also have the privilege of being involved with and running two quite large pilots in South Asia, one in Bangladesh and one in India. And basically what I'll say today will draw on the data from our experiments and from sort of parallel experiments that have taken place. The first thing though that I want to underline is that there is already loads of data from the world of UBI experimentation, but also the kind of sister world of cash transfer intervention. Cash transfers are basically UBIs, though often short-term and frequently targeted in relation to particular desired outcomes, like getting kids into school or maternal health. The evidence is now so big that many within the basic income world say, we don't need any more experiments. We don't need any more pilots because we've got the data. The evidence from the cash transfer world is even bigger. I often work, mostly have worked in sort of international development, international aid, which I'm very critical. And within that space, cash transfers are understood as and described as one of the more robustly studied forms of policy intervention of all sorts. So the evidence is really there, which of course begs the question why it's not really acted upon by those who make our policies, but that is perhaps a separate conversation. So what does some of the evidence say? I'm going to begin by dispelling a couple of common misconceptions. So the first, and you probably would have heard this if you're familiar with conversations around UBI and social policy reform, is that people won't work. If people get money for nothing, they're going to do nothing. They'll be sat at home. They'll be on the beach. Productivity will decline. The overall pot will shrink, and in the end, things will fall apart. That is not borne out by the evidence in any way, shape, or form. Pilots across the world have broadly shown either sort of steady state in terms of how much time people invest in paid work, or in many instances, slight increases. The underemployed will invest in assets, for example, or work more. In India and Bangladesh, what we're seeing, people are buying rickshaws, people are buying sewing machines. In rural pilots that have taken place, people have bought livestock. There's quite an established sort of body of evidence that shows that people actually do a bit more. With one exception, which is where certain segments of the recipient population who also have significant care responsibilities might choose to work a little bit less, which I think under no circumstances can we consider to be problematic. Indeed, that's very likely a significant positive. The second very common misconception, closely tying in with the sort of discourse around the feckless and the idle poor, is basically that people will piss it up the wall. They'll receive their basic income, they'll go on the razzle, they'll be taking drugs, and it'll be a waste of money. Again, this is in no way borne out by the evidence. To the extent that we understand what the literature tells us and what the evidence from various forms of experiments tell us is that there isn't a net increase in people's consumption of so-called temptation goods, booze, drugs, fags, whatever. People, when they receive money, typically, and the evidence for this is sort of associated more than anything with salaries, there will be a spike of people going out. Anyone who's had a job and received a paycheck at the end of the week and wants to escape their month of capitalist strife will likely go out. So that's well established, but has nothing to do with unconditionality. This is established in the wage labour world as well. The third sort of common misconception is around individualisation. One of the critiques of UBI is that it's individualistic. It will lead to further atomisation because it's an individual grant, right? And there's reason to be concerned about that. Again, the data don't seem to indicate that this is the case. If anything, the opposite's the case. In Namibia, one of the largest pilots that took place about 20 years ago, we saw a significant uptick in sort of communal activity, community work, community organising. This has been seen in other pilots, including to some extent in the ones that I'm involved with in South Asia. So there's no evidence to suggest that there is likely to be a sort of further atomisation as a result of this, though more study would be useful, I suspect. What are the positives? There are a decent chunk. The first, quite intuitively I think, is that the data show that people basically cope better. People, when they have a sort of solid and reliable flow of money coming into their accounts or into their hands every month, are more able to deal with the vagaries and the shocks of life under capitalism. In our project in Bangladesh, we asked people every month, how would you rate your ability to cope with shocks, crises of one sort or another, which are enormously common in general, but particularly common and particularly severe for the poorest, as I think we know equally from here. And the graph basically went like that until the cash started, and then it went like that. So there's a very clear indication that people's kind of resilience, economic resilience, capacity to cope is unsurprisingly increased when they have money in their pockets. That manifests in a degree of sort of budgetary ease. People can do more things with the little they have, which I'll say more about in a minute. Significantly tied to this is a reduction in debt. We've seen in pilots across the world that debt goes down, people are able to pay off their credit, they pay their bills. In a very, very interesting study that's currently ongoing in the US state of Georgia with black women, one of the more marginalized and discriminated against and impoverished populations in the United States. Participants are receiving 2 years of unconditional basic income. We're about a third of the way through. One of the kind of most telling stories that is emerging from preliminary results is people paying off their debts, people getting out of credit, people possibly getting ahead and feeling considerably less stressed as a result. That's the next point. The data really, really clearly suggest, from this pilot, from others, from ours, that one of the major impacts of a UBI is a reduction in stress and an increase in mental well-being. Again, for anyone that's been skint, this will be somewhat intuitive. I'm aware that most of our policymakers have never experienced that reality and therefore don't have such an intuition. But Anyone that has lived on the breadline, has struggled to make ends meet, will know very clearly, and the research on this is enormously well established, that it is enormously burdensome, enormously stressful, enormously emotionally challenging to not know whether you're going to make it after payday, to not know whether you'll make it to payday. Maybe you don't even have a payday. What the evidence suggests is that when people have this reliable flow of cash that is in their pocket that they can trust, stress levels decrease, well-being goes up. I could stop there as far as I'm concerned. As far as I'm concerned, there's not even necessarily much more that needs to be said to make the moral case for UBI as a potential plank of social protection reform. But there is more, so bear with me. Health and education. People routinely invest more in their health and in their education. In our work, we're seeing kids go back to school, stop working, restart, maybe continue after an age point at which they would traditionally have had to stop because they are so poor. We see this in the US, we've seen this in Canadian pilots as well. People also go back to school or they retrain. Health benefits are some very clearly articulated by the evidence. For example, around the composition of people's diets. Nutrition improves. People eat more proteinous foods. People will eat more vegetables. The long-term benefits of this, particularly from when we're talking about children as they mature, are well established. The most important point, at least for me, sort of emotionally, spiritually, politically, revolves around dignity. Really across the board, what we are seeing, particularly in the qualitative research, by which I basically mean talking to people. Research is sort of divided into quant, which is loads of numbers and briefly talking to people, and qual, which is where you talk to people a lot. That's the bit that I do. And what you hear, what I have heard, overwhelmingly points in the direction of enhanced dignity. People feel like they matter. They feel like they matter in a world that tells them, for multiple reasons, and as a result of multiple structural inequalities, that they don't. We see this in two particular ways. One is in relation to the social security system. I don't want to use the word benefits. I hate that word. I think it's a shitty word. I think it's an ideological trick to teach us that we don't necessarily deserve what arguably should be our right. It's extremely well established, and anyone in this room that will have had experiences of the social security system will know that typically those experiences are punitive. They are exclusive, they are shaming. People hate going to access conditional benefits on all continents. Being able to avoid that shit and have something unconditional significantly enhances people's dignity. We also see people's dignity enhanced by really little things that are enormously emotionally meaningful around, for example, participation in social life. One little anecdote from our research in India. One of the women we work with in one of the slum communities in the city of Hyderabad, a very old grandma who makes her living from begging on the street. When she has been receiving the basic income, she hasn't stopped begging, she continues to make her living in that way. She uses the basic income, basically puts it as a side, as a sort of form of social security, and reported to us being able to do little, enormously meaningful things like buy sweets for her grandchildren. To me, again, I could stop there, because if we are talking about a policy that enhances people's sense of dignity and belonging as part of the wider social fabric by doing something as minor but transformative as being able to buy grandchildren sweets, then we're looking in a progressive direction. A couple of bits to finish though. Cleo rightly mentioned, cash alone is not enough. One of the obvious and common critiques of UBI, especially on the left, is that alone cash is not going to overcome patriarchy. It's not going to dismantle racial hierarchies. That's true, and anyone that tells you otherwise is a charlatan, really. We need to be advocating for a whole suite of policies alongside UBI to make sure that we maximise its transformational benefits. And I think that's probably one of the significant tasks of anyone engaged in UBI advocacy, if for no other reason than to see this potential critique off at the pass. But a couple of pieces that emerge from the research around this, which kind of underlie the point. In a handful of studies, including the ones that we were working on in South Asia, Pilots accompany cash with similarly unconditional and similarly solidaristic forms of community organising, social work. Basically, we carpet love bomb the communities that we're working with community organisers who are just literally there. And in contrast to social workers here and in many other parts of the world who have to spend 75% of their time filling in forms and very little time connecting at a human level with people and their needs, the community organisers in these pilots and a couple in the US do just that. So they're just there, they listen, they empathise, they provide space for people to have their needs heard, they connect people to services that they may otherwise be excluded from, they facilitate forms of collective action. In Hyderabad, a waste picker union is in the process of being formed. What's really important about all of this, apart from being in and of itself massively cool, and I think very much the way forward for sort of thinking through UBI as a pillar of social security reform, I'm an advocate of UBI plus, if you like, is that the evidence appears to tell us that in and of itself, this relational work matters and is powerfully impactful, and it increases the impact of the cash. So the future, I think, is very much UBI and cash as a tool of social security. But really, where I think we need to be pushing is in the direction of UBI plus, as something even more radical, even more transformative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil. Kate, how are you getting on? Are you going to have to head? Don't want to trap you on the stage. Can we give Kate another big thank you for today and everything she does? Thank you. Will, did you want to say something? Did you have anything you wanted to add from what you've heard so far? That mic should work. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, maybe we'll let it open up in a second, I guess. Thanks for having me. And we're very happy to have Cleo as part of Autonomy now. I guess one thing just to pose a question here for those, just maybe to start discussion in a way. I think a lot of what's been said, and I think the reason why basic income is so important to have on the agenda as part of the policy programme is it responds to a lack, basically. The left, in general, I would say the left are not great on welfare, basically. I think that's for various historical reasons, but it's hard to think of what is the left's vision for welfare, basically. Because we have to think of something, because conditionality, the system that we have, obviously the UK is a particularly pernicious system. You speak to people from in Scandinavia or Germany and so on, their social security system is demonstrably better. So we have a pretty bad here, but in general, conditionality is the problem. If you look at any of the academic research on conditionality, whether it's Lisa Scullion or Sharon Wright, research, huge longitudinal studies on conditionality, they don't have good job outcomes. It's punitive, it's shameful, it's exactly what Neil was talking about. Now, basic income or unconditional income is a response to this system, and it's got to be part of a wider suite of services and so on, absolutely. But it is a question for us, and it's something which we need to be able to have an answer to, and that's why I think basic income is so important here. In some form of basic income, and I think as Cleo alluded to, there's a set of characteristics which make it basic income, but obviously most basic incomes that we've seen in different pilots and so on have slightly variations on it. Some form will be necessary if we want to have the kind of society and economy, social life and so on that we want, basically. And I think that's significant, and I will stop. I think that's significant because we are going to inevitably have to have higher spend states as the cascades of crises kind of continue into this century. We've seen COVID, we've seen the cost of living crisis, more interventionist states. That's going to happen. And how do we define on what terms that is, and where does the money go, and where does the money come from, basically? These are basic questions that we're going to have to ask ourselves during these high spend state, the high spend state era that we're going to have to be working within. So things like the energy price guarantee and all this other stuff, these are all just the initial trickles of much more state intervention. We need to make sure that that state intervention is for the many, as it were. And that's tackling the welfare question needs to be entwined with that. And I think we've been historically, whether it's because people think cash is evil and money is capital and therefore money is evil, that's sometimes what the left say. And I think that's like I said, that's a terrible take, because people's, nonetheless, you're basically ignoring people's everyday needs. When you think about how to make cash more democratic, how to make cash less, there's less of a boss at the end of the cash. This is more of a progressive take than saying cash itself is evil, we shouldn't give people cash. I think that's a total dead end. So anyway, I think it's an open question, one which we need to answer, and I'll be interested to hear what everyone has to say about what is the future of welfare if we agree that conditionality is a problem, and if we agree that we need to make sure that we redistribute more wealth in this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. How are we feeling? Have you got questions, comments? Great, hands straight up. Have we got mics to pick up questions? Thank you. Maybe we shout for this first one and I can repeat it back and then we can do mics for the rest. Go for it.
All right, no worries. My name's Matt. My question is, do you have an example of where UBI has been rolled out on a broader scale than a particularly targeted population? Because I think we've seen over the last 40 years the social security system smashed by neoliberals, by conservatives. And how do we protect the UBI from those same forces? Because if it's a targeted program, then it's just going to be smashed. I think it's exposed to the same arguments or the same pressures that our social security system has already been smashed by.
Thank you. So question from Matt there on, do we have examples of basic income that is more universal? I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the Alaska Permanent Fund. So this is a permanent fund in Alaska that's been established since the 80s. So I think it's written into the Constitution there. So pretty, solidly embedded in Alaska. The revenue does come from the sale of oil, which is obviously incredibly problematic, but at the same time it's a dividend of a kind of collectively owned resource, I suppose, and the profits made from that, which I, with putting oil aside, think is a really important and fantastic model for a basic income, acknowledging that there are commons that we all have a stake in and that no individual should, consciously own and, own all the profits from. So that is something that is, it's an annual dividend and it varies every year depending on how much that fund generates. You might have some other more exciting.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, there's nowhere that's rolled this out nationally. It doesn't exist. That's very much that's the struggle really everywhere. There are places that are close. There are places that have meaningfully considered it, but it hasn't been rolled out nationally. In terms of large-scale, long-term, ongoing sort of quasi-experiments. One of the most important is Alaska, definitely not a liberal political space, certainly would fall into the conservative end or onto the conservative end of the spectrum, and yet this has been maintained and constitutionally enshrined. But one of the more important experiments, pseudo-experiments if you like, is with the Cherokee Nation in the US. They have, through essentially bringing into public ownership the proceeds of out-of-state casinos, managed to enshrine in their distributive politics a basic income. And the evidence is massively, massively positive across all of the sort of range of indicators that I mentioned before. Beyond that, there is a whole bunch of political science research, which maybe Will might speak to, or others will know perhaps better than I, but that points in the direction of universality as politically expedient as well as morally attractive. We appear to know from data that things like the NHS, that which is universal and accessible to everybody, including those who don't necessarily need it, but who will, by virtue of its universality, feel like they belong as part of this political community, and redistributive policies also somehow serve them. They are much harder to get rid of than things which are targeted and segment and divide and rule populations into those who are more or less deserving or more or less human. So there is a body of evidence to suggest this is very much the way to go.
I just want to add to that two things. One is that in the Finnish experiment of basic income, some of the questions they were asking participants was really around their relationship to the state and their interface with services, and there was a huge increase in kind of trust. There's a greater sense of trust that, effectively the state has given me resources to spend as I want, and I feel that actually the state's actually delivering for me. So in a way, that universality and the delivering was actually really important. The final point of what your question was that you kind of turned to think about it being attacked and potentially withered away, and I think this is just exactly the reason why, every kind of anything, the labour market, anything within social security, it's always contested terrain, right? And that's why it's not going to be given to us, or the right kind of welfare, let's say, the welfare which is unconditional, which does allow people to live lives without being under the cosh of the state. That's not something that the state itself is going to deliver, particularly under conservative administration, right? So this is why campaigning is important. This is why, I think having a coherent and having unity around the demands, welfare demands, is so important. Otherwise, we are going to have some kind of impoverished form of it. There is, in South Africa, it does look likely that some form of basic income will come in within the next 1 or 2 years. And you've got the ANC, you've got the Communist Party, and the trade unions are all backing some form of basic income. The struggle now, according to researchers in the area, is that how to make this the best form of basic income possible rather than some impoverished kind of, not what we consider to be a basic income. So that's one to watch, because that will be a country doing it. It's one of the most, I think it actually is officially the most unequal country in the world right now, because of huge kind of polarization. So that's an interesting one to watch. And it's very interesting that basically all the left, the institutional left in that country are supporting it. So let's see how that campaign goes, basically.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's something about universality that makes something visible, right? Like it's harder to erode something that we're all aware of, we all interact with, and that, I think, why universal is so desirable in the context of basic income. We should probably do shorter answers because I already saw lots of hands. Any more questions? Fab. Whoever you feel like you can get to first, I guess. There's a couple in the front row. There's a mic there for you. Is that okay to use? Thank you.
I'm 82.
Amazing.
And by now I've seen a lot of things happen. And I really feel this time round, there's so much happened during the pandemic. The corruption that's happened in this country is unbelievable. And I don't care whether it's Keith Starmer, Jeremy Corbyn, whoever took the job on, it's going to be a hell of a job. But I believe there is solutions. And I believe the people in this country who are experts can find those solutions. We are entering a new world. We entered it when we got new technology. Things should have been put in place that we wouldn't be in the position we're in now. That people wouldn't be ashamed that they're not working. Or they've got 3 jobs and they still can't pay the rent. So today, I've come here because I believe there's a positive mood in the country, but there's also a mood that's not going to be put down with the next government.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of important stuff to say there. I think we can't be compromising on what we're saying at the moment, whether we consider ourselves experts or not. It's the non-experts that take the brunt of saying what is the reality at the moment, and I think there's more people who are experts that need to trailblaze that as well. There was a hand up there, the check shirt, person in the check shirt. Come at the other end, thank you.
Cheers. Thanks very much. And yeah, particularly interesting hearing case studies from India and South Africa, particularly because the British inventions of the prepaid water meters have disproportionately affected marginalized communities in both those places, and are systematically killing people essentially to individualize the statutory responsibility for human rights and access to water, and that's a British invention, so it's really refreshing to hear this conversation about UBI being rolled out as pilots in those places. So along a similar line to Australian comrades' question, I'm wondering, in order to successfully launch UBI programs, it's clear that we need to match our objectives, right, to the strategies of the powers that be, who are the ones oftentimes giving those usual rebuttals about as you said, drugs, alcohol, and bags, if people had a bit more cash. So this strategic alignment is clearly the next step in order to take this forward. But my question is, how do we market that intervention to neoliberals without losing the unwavering focus on enhanced dignity rather than enhanced productivity workforce? Thank you.
Good question, spicy question. I really agree on the aligning strategies as well, actually, and I think, the reason that we've lent into pilots over the last few years is because, it feels disingenuous to me to talk about basic income for a living without putting cash in people's pockets as an objective in the short term. That's the title of today, and that is the sort of intention of what we're trying to do at the moment. And I think this is how we make the case to everyone, including neoliberals. I think you need to be able to hear people say this is what it did for me in a context that feels close enough, I think, for the electorate, I think for the big people to win over to actually secure a policy like basic income. You know, I guess it's kind of similar to sort of a trade union fight, right? Like you say, this is what we want to do, and they go, okay, well, this is how we can do it, nice and diluted, and it doesn't really work for anyone. And then that's that tension, that healthy tension gets put in, and it becomes a fight again, and you make sure you fight for something that is built around dignity rather than convenience for powers that be. Any thoughts for that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I mean, it's a question of strategy, as you say, and it's probably a longer conversation than one you can answer just in a kind of pithy response. I would say, maybe I'm going to take the opportunity to say that I think basic income in the form that we're talking about it, and in fact most forms, and this is probably the premise of your question, is directly counter to neoliberal paternalism on welfare. I mean, we shouldn't. Obviously, we all know now, of course, that neoliberalism wasn't about rolling back the state, but it's about actually kind of rolling back the state in some places, but heavily intervening in people's lives in other places. And conditionality systems, which is our current welfare system, you know, Lawrence Mead, this organic intellectual of the third way, Mandelson, all these people, their plans were explicitly about getting involved in people's lives and making sure they had like responsibilities and things like that. And so I think in terms of when you ask the question about alignment, I see this more as this is the reason why it's the time for UPI now is precisely because we're going to be overturning that failed system over 25 years. So there is a question of strategy about how to speak to different politicians, let's say, and speak to different actors who have different material interests. But I think for me, it's hard to square the basic income we're talking about with a neoliberal project, basically. And so sometimes demands don't align, and sometimes demands have to be made, and policies have to be put forward and advocated and campaigned on, which do go against the neoliberal mindset. For me, that's my initial thought on it.
I would agree with that. I just want to add one other thing though. I have a hunch that part of a sort of like a cheeky, potentially quite sophisticated strategy is, although I have no idea because it needs a lot of work to develop, but some work on this has been done, is to basically employ and use the concept of freedom, right? Freedom is, you know, the Euro concept of capital, not neoliberal capital in particular, but capitalism more broadly. And the kind of like core ideological myth, if you like, under capitalism is that we are free to choose to sell our labour to X, Y, Z. Obviously, we all know that's total bollocks, but it nevertheless remains the kind of like pillar truth that they claim. I have a hunch or wondering whether being able to empirically demonstrate that capitalism doesn't necessarily lead to free choice for labour at the foot of the ladder, but B, by contrast, supporting people with an unconditional kind of cash floor may at least confront certain capitalists with the sort of hypocrisy baked into the positions that they have. So like I said, there's a lot more work that needs to be done on this theoretically. I've done a little bit. I think there's something potentially Trojan horsey about using that particular concept. It's just one possible idea.
Excellent. We'll go to this side. Person towards the back in the blue t-shirt. Thank you.
My name's David. We had irregular cash payments by various governments in the aftermath of COVID. I'm wondering if you think that has meaningfully moved us down the road towards a basic income, and indeed whether there could be a way of like getting to a basic income through more stuff like that.
Yeah, great question. Good idea. We'll take a couple of questions if someone can write them down because my brain is like a sieve. Person, beautiful patterned dress there. Thank you. Yeah, we can. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm very pro UBI, and one of the arguments that I come up against for why we shouldn't implement UBI is that it would be much better for economies of scale and for value for money if we invested the money that would go in UBI into universal basic services. So, investing that money in transport, for example, instead. I don't think it's obviously quite the same thing, but I'd be interested to hear your arguments for that. Thanks.
Excellent. Yeah, I think there's probably a lot in those two, or should we take a third? Hands back up. This one? Yes, thank you. Black top. Person. Wearing black top.
For a basic income funded by redistribution of wealth, I'm wondering how the panel envisions the regulation of multinationals and the super rich in a world where there's offshore tax havens and when international regulation is notoriously difficult to enforce.
Great question. I have forgotten the first question, so I'm going to pass it to Neil.
Yeah, so there's like the COVID impact, temporary cash transfer measures, kind of emergency UBI stuff. Does it advance the debate? We don't really know, and the research that exists is limited and new and not very conclusive. But there are a couple of pieces. One is that, certainly from the polling that I've seen, it seems that the idea of UBI has gained significant ground in large parts of the world, including here. And it's entirely plausible that that is as a result of the unconditional cash that people received during the pandemic, more likely the organising that took place around that to ask for more, push this in the direction of something permanent, and raise awareness amongst people that actually there is another way and this might be what it looks like. There are some dangers though, and some people caution against trying to sneak a UBI in through emergency measures, through the potentially negative sort of permanent framing of UBI as something emergency. The evidence is inconclusive, but I think both are reasonable positions to take. On the UBS thing, look, for me, the notion that there is some division between basic income and basic services is a total red herring, and I would urge all of you to walk straight away from that red herring. To me, it's such a bizarre debate, this thing. It seems to me almost, implicitly within the we can't afford both, is the acceptance that the size of the pot is appropriate. It isn't. Obviously, we need to be raising more funds for public expenditure. Obviously, that needs to come from significantly increased taxes of the rich and of corporations and so on and so forth. So the idea that we can have one or the other and we can't really expand our cake, I just totally reject that. We've already lost the ideological game if that's where our starting point is. So that can get in the bin as far as I'm concerned. It is evidently, though, entirely necessary that we decommodify ever further spheres of people's lives through the provision of universally accessible, free at the point of usage services, whether that be transport, whether that be healthcare, education, whatever. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, a transformative program necessarily has to encompass both. There are problems from the level of people's individual autonomy with the argument that services alone are the answer. We know that services are wonderful, services can be better, but there's a lot of evidence that the nature of service provision historically has infringed upon people's autonomy, particularly people who diverge from the norm that services are typically set up to provide for. So whilst I'm massively on the services train, the idea that you get on that train rather than the UBI train, I think just forget that. Last point on the multimedia and the multinationals and super rich. I mean, I don't know, I'm not a macro political economist, I'm not exactly sure what design of a tax system I would want to advocate other than tax the living shite out of them, obviously.
Well, do you want to focus on the last one? I mean, I know that the other two are the ones.
Well, I think, okay, I'll focus on the last. Well, there is a friend and great economist, Aaron Advani. He's done a lot of work on wealth taxes, and there's a lot of decent studies out there around kind of dispelling the myth that rich people would just leave. There's lots of reasons why rich people wouldn't leave. They might have had roots here, their kids might go to school here, and so on. There's all sorts of also case studies where taxes have been hiked in other countries on the wealthy, and it hasn't. It's basically more of a myth, a very useful myth for the very rich and the corporations say, well, we're all just going to leave. I was thinking, we autonomy with Slovenia a few years ago, and Slovenia's either number 1 or 2 most equal countries in the world according to the Gini coefficient. It's not a super wealthy country, but everything is, employers pay for commuting. You know, we went there thinking, hey, we've got a radical policy, your employer should pay for half your commute, but they're like, the employer pays for all our commute. Like, okay, great, see you later, peace. So there are countries where wealth is much better distributed, and they still have prosperity, even if they're not rich countries. So I guess the point I'm making here is that I'd be very wary of, particularly the individuals. Corporations like Capital Flight is perhaps slightly more of a realistic threat, but I think we shouldn't be afraid, as that as some kind of backstop argument, to not have a kind of serious redistributive measures. On the UBS thing, really briefly, I agree with what Neil said, but I think there's something, Neil was slightly more pithy than I'm going to be. I think there's an interesting question around UBS and UBI, around what counts as basic and what counts as a life which is, what is deprivation, what is basic, and so on. And I've written about this before, but I think, there's an interesting history in sociology around when people, what have sociologists thought as a kind of basic standard of living, below which no one should fall. And it took a while, basically from the 70s and 80s and 90s, sociologists started asking people what they think people need to have a kind of a dignified life. And so you have these studies in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2012, and now the minimum income standard, where people say, what things and what activities do you think people should be able to do? And I think that's that data there, which I'll say now, that data there is actually what we should be thinking about when we think about this combination of services and income. So, for example, being able to go on holiday, so transport, or being able to kind of visit relatives, transport, fine. So that's a service, right? There's also things like a winter coat, or money to buy a gift for my child to buy a gift for their friend, or be able to go to the pub once a week, or things like that. These are all things which, some of them, definitely, like internet, things like that. The internet, interesting, obviously in the 80s didn't exist in the survey, 90s, but very few people thought it was essential, 2012, absolutely essential. You can use that data to understand, well, what stuff should be a service, and what stuff should we be giving cash to people, right? Like, things like a winter coat, toys for your kids, you don't want that to be a service, right? So I think there's an interesting conversation, and I think that's something which that demonstrates to me that, like, what should be universally accessible to everyone can be delivered and should be delivered in different ways. I don't care which bus comes and collects me in a way. I want it to be free and regular, but I want to choose what I do with my diet, for example.
That's about dignity and autonomy.
Yeah.
This is fundamentally about dignity, and it's fundamentally about autonomy. We may all, as human beings, share the same fundamental human needs, but the ways in which we go about satisfying them will be infinitely varied. Cash in cash society provides the flexibility for people to have autonomy over choosing how they go about doing that. Services really could never do that.
We seem to have Slovenia and Neil's mum in the house. What a crowd we have, it's great. For me, the services are essential, right? And for me, the framing of universal basic services is actually quite unhelpful, because I think each service is so resonant with the people that need that service so deeply. But I think the reality of the country that we live in at the moment is we only have so much fight in us, and there is so much to fight for with the services that currently exist. We can't show up to that fight if we have no money in our pocket. So that, to me, is a pragmatic reason why I think a basic income needs to come first, because we have no time to fight the fights that need to be fought at the moment. My background is in the third sector, small-scale charities, direct community responses to social problems. It burns people out. They have a couple of years in them of passion, they just about get something functioning. Funding is cut because of the way that funding cycles work, the way that money moves in places, or in organisations and communities that are solving, or at least trying to address, social problems. We can't fight the universal basic services that actually adequately meet our needs unless we have time to do that. And to do that, you have to give people unconditional money to turn up to things, to town halls, to do something with their time that allows them to contribute to their communities. And it's beyond belief that we're expecting people to do more of that than they currently are, because it's people in those communities who are already doing that are just about keeping everyone afloat. And that ties to me into what I want to see from redistribution of wealth. I think it needs to be visible. We need to be able to see, some way of seeing where the money is currently hoarded. I think I would love to see some sort of institution that does a bit more of that, some unpacking of that, and turning people's eyes towards it. But I think that needs to happen on a local scale. I really like the idea of community wealth funds that feed into a basic income pot, not as the only source of it, but as maybe a top-up, a local top-up. If you prosper on a local level, you're the basic income dividend for people that have contributed to that pot, and the thriving of that local community economically get an extra slice on their basic income. And that is intrinsically linked to where the corporations that currently are able to extract capital from our communities at the moment, educating is such a patronising term, but meaning that everyone has a stake in fighting against that. Like that everyone has enough time and enough energy and enough solidarity and spaces to think about where money is moving around those communities. I think it's not a simple answer. Like you can't just flick a switch with one perfect model and redistribute things. Like it is going to be a process, and we need to have as many people as possible involved in that process for it to actually be effective, and coming back to your point, for it not to be worn away quickly and overnight when someone's political project decides. And final, on the fight that we're fighting currently, that through COVID we did see an incredible spike of interest, particularly from politicians, that literally said to us in meetings on a daily basis during early COVID, I always thought that I didn't really get it, I didn't really get the universal thing, but now I really, really do, because we need a universal system to get income to people because they can't go to work tomorrow, and we do not have that. That has quieted down a little bit. The sort of, the number of people that are willing to show up to things is still quite high. I think that awareness has really been built. I think we're building on a high foundation. Certainly from the public, I think it's a bit different. I think, there is everyone that had to go through a process of claiming universal credit, everyone that lost their job, there is some realisation that's never going to turn back there, but whether that's going to lead to a basic income really depends on campaigns like ours, but also the conversations that you have with people about basic income. So that's really important. Any more questions, more comments? Excellent. Can we bring the mic around to this at the back in the grey? Excellent. Yes, please. Thank you. Thanks for patience, everyone.
Hi, I think EBA is really important, but I sometimes get quite annoyed at the way it's presented in left-wing media as some golden bullet, which in isolation will be able to fix all our problems. I wondered if you could talk, I'm glad that Neil mentioned about this idea of EBA plus, what has to accompany it. Maybe could you delve into some of the other road bumps? I know, for example, in cash schemes in Malawi, there was a real issue with women bearing the entire brunt of looking after the household and education, because of the pre-existing patriarchal structures that existed there. And similarly, in a society where so many commodities are fundamentally monopolized, how would you prevent companies just upping prices when they know that everyone has the sufficient income to be able to pay for those things?
Great, thank you. We'll take another couple of questions in the green t-shirt, and we'll go check. Sorry to refer you to buy your clothes, that's quite productive.
Basic income does seem to be quite popular among certain right-wing billionaire oligarchs, presumably because they hope that once instituted they could then use it as an argument for getting rid of the minimum wage, or at least lowering it and that sort of thing. So I was wondering, what are the sort of nerdy technical differences between a basic income as envisaged by the left and one as envisaged by oligarchs, or is it more just a difference of opinion on what the anticipated consequences would be?
Great question. Pass it down, thank you.
Hi, thanks. There seems to be a theme with these three questions, but I was going to ask, slightly provocatively maybe, but does this prop up poverty wages, and would it disempower trade unions?
Nice, simple, love it. Yeah, I think, there is definitely a theme with these questions. I think my answer is probably quite similar to all of them, and it's about the political project rather than the policy proposal. I think we have to be realistic about what a single policy can achieve, and like we've said, a basic income is about putting cash in people's pockets. That is basically the only arm that it has. So all of the unintended consequences around it's certainly not for people running pilots. It's something that we have our fingers in our ears and hands over our eyes about. They're really important to address, but it kind of comes with a suite of measures around it, right? And for me, the difference between the proposal that we're making and the proposal that billionaires might be making is we want to do it in solidarity with the people that are going to be most directly affected by it, or that have the potential to most benefit from it, that really need to benefit from it. And that comes from working in solidarity with workers and convincing trade unions to invest some time in building a basic income that does build bargaining power rather than weaken it, which I think is very, very possible, because it means that you have something to fall back on if you need to address problems in a workplace. Propping up poverty wages, again, that's an issue that needs to be addressed by policy around wages, not around a basic income. It needs to come in an accompanying policy.
Thanks. First question, like UBI is a silver bullet and add-ons, again, it's definitely not a silver bullet, and everything you articulate is sort of potential pitfalls, spot on. As I said before, there are a handful of experiments that are attempting to kind of directly engage with the lack built into cash alone, and to provide mitigations. In India, the community organisers basically run sort of feminist-inspired action research processes with women to support women to advocate for greater power within the domestic sphere, within their communities, and the results look decently positive. In Chicago, there's a pilot with informal economy workers, black informal economy workers, and they're organising, building collective power. In previous research that's taken place in India, the cash was accompanied by, again, union presence, and the evidence was really compelling that in those places where the union was present, the impacts of the cash were greater. So I don't think that there's, to me at least in the context of experimentation, there's not like a definitively right way of doing it. From the macro perspective of what are the suite of policies we need, I'm not going to go into them, we've heard lots of them over the course of the last couple of days, but you can imagine some of what they are. My own sort of dream, my fantasy, if you like, of part of the revolutionary pathway is UBI plus this massive land army of unconditional community organisers. The way we theorise that in the small case of our experiment is with the cash sort of providing time, respite from the pressures of capital, and the organising providing space to imagine different ways of being. And I think there is something potentially fruitful in that combination at scale. With regards to the monopoly piece, we don't know. There's no evidence really from experimentation that things like that happen, though. So it's plausible, very likely, any potential sort of monopoly rents attaching to a UBI would necessarily require government intervention to prevent, along with pretty much everything else. On the left versus right and the oligarchs thing, you may not have gathered this from my presentation, but I'm actually a right-wing billionaire oligarch. And I am advocating this, no, jokes aside, there's a whole bunch, right, particularly in California, there's sort of tech bro revolutionaries. Their version of UBI is very much like, essentially technology is going to render everybody redundant, how do we feel better about them not dying? It's quite miserable. And the kind of neoliberal wet dream of a UBI sort of keeps people barely alive while stripping back everything else that would provide for their subsistence. So their version of a UBI, Friedman's version of UBI, to the extent there was one, exists as an alternative to any other form of public provision, any other form of public goods. That is exactly the opposite for us. So it's important for anybody on the left, I think, to distinguish between those two and make it very clear that UBI is part of a suite. On the last bit with regards to sort of poverty, wages and unions, it's plausible. However, I mean, classical economic theory argues in the other direction, that if people have the ability, by virtue of having their means of subsistence taken care of, to withdraw from the labour market, they can collectively organise to push their wages up. So there's a sort of quite compelling theoretical case that that's what would happen. Would it weaken unions? On the revolutionary horizons, we don't need unions, right? Unions don't necessarily need to exist. Unions exist as one form of collective power for the working class, which is sadly very often occupationally based, as a consequence of which the kind of historical momentum behind them leads them typically to advocate for protecting that little bit of the corner of the world that they've managed to keep grassy at the expense of all other workers. UBI, I think, is something that in some respects achieves the sort of revolutionary potential inherent in union work, but for everybody rather than sectorally. So to me, a UBI is something that all unions, like as a no-brainer, need to be getting behind. And there's a whole other conversation about the histories of why they haven't and how problematic it is. So maybe it would render them irrelevant. If it were to render them irrelevant, it would be on the revolutionary horizon when we didn't necessarily need them. Before that point, quite to the contrary, the collective power that unions are able to mobilise and organise would be absolutely essential for entrenching the kind of progressive UBI that we want to see, defending it against attack, and then seeing it expand, and the commons that it represents expand ever further across the social sphere. Thanks.
Cool. Really briefly, thanks for really good questions. Take oligarchs thing. I think the other response might be, to some extent, that UBIs, it's like a hot new idea which oligarchs or like tech billionaires will often talk about. So I'm thinking about Zuckerberg and Musk, for example. They chat a lot of crap a lot of the time. I don't think we should take them at their word. And B, if you confronted them with the taxation scheme necessary to fund a robust basic income and say you're going to be taxed right to the hill, I don't think they'd be supporting half as much. They say they support basic income, but if you say, well, actually, how are we going to pay for it? It's going to be coming out of your pocket. They're very good at avoiding paying their fair share, right? So I don't think we should just assume that because Musk and Zuckerberg talk about this, that they think that, for example, there's like two sides to this story. And I know your question was more nuanced about what's the technical detail. Well, taxation is one of these details where we say it's going to be funded by wealth tax, a higher income tax on those at the very top. Also, the OpenAI scheme, which I only found out, I was having an interview with a journalist, and the OpenAI scheme where I only found out there's like a digital coin they want to give to everyone as long as you give them, as long as you let them scan your eyeballs. That's something apparently that's a genuine form of UBI, and you can see how that's directly contrary to the dignity which we want to build to a basic income. You shouldn't have to get a basic income just because your eyeball gets scanned. The price question is a good one. Companies are keeping, as we've seen in this recent crisis, companies are keeping prices high already. There's lots of price gouging already. We need to have action. There needs to be action on that anyway. Also, rent controls. It's something which we need anyway, but obviously we want to see that when we want to have like a higher floor. We also want to make sure that that's not just extracted by the rentier class, right? That is just true. That is where our wages go now anyway. So we'd have action. Take action on that. The final point, I think, first off, we don't really want to do an either or about having decent welfare and like strong trade unions, right? We want to say, oh no, we can't have decent welfare because they'll undermine the unions. That having kind of like the labour market or the works of the labour market. That we don't want to, from the start. We don't want to do that. But I think it's worth noting, a slightly different response to Neil's, that trade unions, I think, are a stakeholder in this, not only because of Neil's first point that, of course, having stronger welfare is a good thing for those in the labour market and therefore for the members of trade unions, but also in this country, before we got the proper welfare state, it was trade unions' insurance schemes, which are the first protection outside of work. So if you're out of work, the trade union will pay your wages while you're looking for work. So they already recognised the necessity for economic security, and they had their own schemes before it got taken up by the state. So I think both they're a strong interest group in there being decent welfare. And one final point is that I'm recently rereading Melinda Cooper's book, Family Values, which is fantastic, and she makes this point that in the 70s, at the height of a particular peak of trade union militancy in America, and the administration figuring out what to do, cracking down on welfare was one of their first actions, and there's explicitly this quote saying, strong welfare, which at that time it was much more generous or substantive than now, strong welfare is effectively a strike fund for the unions. And the administration recognised that then, and they saw that as a problem. And so that's why they wiped out welfare and ended up with Clinton saying, end of welfare as we know it. So I think it's important to note when the powers that be, the enemies of strong welfare, are the ones saying this is going to help trade unions. That's the little anecdote.
Yeah, and I think basic income, it's not by accident that it could be a strike fund. That is exactly what we want it to be, because, as I said earlier, there's fights to be fought, and we need to be resourced to be able to do that. We started a bit late. I think we've got another 5 minutes unless someone starts waving at me. Who wants to ask a final few questions? I wonder if there's any. Great. Okay, we'll go you yourself. You've been very patient in your blue t-shirt. Yeah, yourself at the front. Thank you.
Hello, I'm from Slovenia, so it's great to hear mention. I would just add, you guys have travel expenses, but it's very classist. It goes to the high-paid job, you can get that paid, you can get food expensed. But my mom is a cleaner in Slovenia, and she gets subsistence for food, travel expenses, and we got this thing called regres, which is a 13th wage. You get the wage every month. And then at the end of the year, you get another wage, so we're able to go on holiday, basically. But to ask a question, how do we scale up the universal basic income so we can have that for everyone? There is this idea of a universal basic dividend floated by economists such as Yanis Varoufakis. So this idea that every time we search something on Google, every time we use these tech platforms, we contribute to their capital. So there is this suggestion that that would be a way to sort of frame this discourse, tax their wealth, and then share that wealth with everyone. Thank you.
Oh yeah, we'll take the questions first, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, give it a wave. Perfect.
Is it useful to draw comparisons to the state pension, or is that sort of unhelpful?
Thank you, love that. And yourself in the front row, thank you. Making you go a long way.
Thank you. This might be something which is kind of linked to, there needs to be lots of other policies at the same time of this to make it work. So, with the NHS, for instance, once it's been implemented, it's very popular. You know, the Tories can't normally say directly that they want to get rid of it because it's too popular, which is a brilliant thing about universal policy. So say you bring in universal basic income. When I was working in admin at my local hospital, I was hearing a lot of these sort of arguments about outsiders are introducing cost, these certain people don't deserve this universal service, if these outsiders weren't taking this universal service, then our service would be better, etc. So my kind of question is, I support UBI, is how do you make sure that truly everybody gets it? And then what's your kind of anticipation of those arguments from the right once it's brought in, of using it to divide people and say, oh, these people are making your universal basic income lower? Like, kind of what's your thoughts around that and making sure that truly everyone gets it?
Yeah, really great question, and a very difficult one, because I think it really requires a cultural shift. I think the biggest barrier to a basic income is the idea of deservingness. They don't deserve it, that person over there is wasting it, they don't deserve this basic income, but also I don't deserve it. Like I said, basic income conversation, we talk to people about it, and the question is, what would you do if you had a basic income? And so many people get a bit of a flap to say, like, well, I don't need an unconditional basic income, I am comfortable, I have enough. But the point is everyone gets it. So I think that those two things are intertwined. You have to make sure that it is a scaled up high enough level that people who currently need a bit extra but are relatively comfortable in comparison to people who have nothing feel a difference with the basic income that they get every month. We need to feel a stake in it, and that also brings me on to my answer to the question of how do you scale it up. I think I quite like a sort of piecemeal patchwork basic income. You know, we start with a basic income for carers. I quite like that as an idea. But I think at some point you do kind of need just a confidently rolled out unilateral universal basic income, and then that again makes the case for universality, and you know, we have to take ownership of that and shift that narrative that not everyone deserves something. Like, we have so many things that say, you know, we want everyone to live with dignity, we want everyone to have a certain standard of living, but when it comes to actually giving people the resources that they need to live with dignity, we are desperate to strip them away from them. We are desperate to put conditions on that. And we love that. You know, like, even when we think we are open-minded and left-wing even, or, you know, we believe in solidarity, at the first opportunity to put a condition on something or to strip it away from them, we are all, you know, and we all need to unlearn that. It's like internalized sexism or racism. It's a constant process to unlearn what we are taught from birth is the right way to treat people. It is not the right way to treat people. And yeah, the final question, I think the state pension is a really, really useful example, because like child benefit, it is pretty much a basic income in the UK at the moment, and you look to retired people and the vast amount that they contribute to society because they get to choose how they spend their time. It's almost 50% of the people that turn up to our basic income conversations to talk about what they would do with a basic income are retired people saying, well, the reason I'm here is because I have time to show up to things like this and to contribute to political conversations and to pull my weight in a way that I haven't been able to through my working life on things that I care about. And we owe them a lot. And they're also then like, sorry, I have to leave early because I'm going to pick up the grandkids, it's such an essential part of our society. So we have retired people who could take on unpaid labour. And that's a beautiful thing, and something that we should point to more often as a beautiful thing.
I think from a communicative standpoint, I always, although I've been ticked off by social policy specialists about this because it's not strictly speaking true, but it doesn't matter. I use the pension analogy as a way of making sense of it. I describe basic incomes, it's like a pension, but for everybody, because it's simple, it's intelligible, and to date, that has seemed to be simple and intelligible, so I think it's quite a useful analogy to use. On the outsiders, how will they divide us, and what will the right do? This is a truly fundamental question. There's a lot of sort of debate around how we go about drawing the lines in the kind of the basic income world of sort of high theory. My stance really would be, whilst we don't yet have it worked out, at a minimum necessarily everyone who's on whatever landmass is implementing basic income needs to be receiving it, as opposed to simply citizens or any other sort of divisive tool. Part of the response and a way to counter this, I think, is through adopting like a politics of abundance, right? We are subject to this politics of lack. We've been told forever that there's just not enough. The greatest trick in many respects in the Wright's book is to have us all believe that the pot isn't big enough, that we don't have enough wonderful resources on this beautiful planet to make sure that we can all survive. That's, again, total bollocks, I think. And being able to directly counter this total bollocks with a politics of abundance that points out the fact that there actually are enough resources there, we aren't using them in a remotely fair or balanced way, we are not distributing them remotely, is part of the fight. I don't think it's the only part of the fight, but I think there's something kind of emotionally, spiritually powerful about sinking into the politics of abundance as opposed to, and as an alternative to this sort of dark, grey, miserable, fucking concrete world of lack that is the world of the right. Last piece on the funding mechanisms, there's loads of proposals. Varoufakis is one about essentially like, taxing the commons that have been enclosed. Is very appealing. Similar policies have been, or proposals have been developed around carbon. Private entities are polluting that which is the commonwealth of all, they need to pay for it. Land taxes, likewise. I mean, land reform is not something that is typically on the agenda, although I massively wish it was. The original enclosure of the commons. There's multiple redistributive ways that seek to sort of take out from the narrow enclosure of that which was once everybody's and use that as a sort of basis dividend for funding a basic income.
I agree with all that about the pensions and also the UBD. I think there's one quick thought on the response about why universality and how to defend it in a way is that what's the thing about UBI, unlike some other policies, that it's not a zero-sum benefit, as it were. We don't like using that word, but it's not a zero. It's got a compound positive when everyone has it, because crime is reduced, general health better, so the services of public health services are less under strain, and so on. So there's actually, I think, this is not it's not a well thought out comms strategy, but this is, I think, the way I want to go with the kind of defence of the universality is that actually the more people have it, the better it is for everyone. It's not saying it's precisely not that I have it therefore they can't, or they have it therefore I can't. It's precisely that actually as more people get it, it's greater than the sum of its individual parts. So
thank you. That's our time. I want to say a massive thank you for letting us steal 7 minutes extra of your time and your patience at the start. Thank you so much for being here. Love to do this again. We're basicincome.conversation.org or autonomy.work. Please get in touch, sign up to the mailing list, follow us on Instagram, say hello. This has been a pleasure. Thank you again.